Hey everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
Barb, John, Jenna. Trying to get this off. My computer's not working that well. How is everybody tonight?
Good.
Good, that's good to hear. Yeah, how was vacation, John? Was it good?
Yes, it was fun. We
Nice.
were partly babysitting granddaughter
Nice.
and reconnect with them, so the weather held, and it was good.
Hi, Lydia. Oh, that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Vacations are great. It's also good to come home too, I guess.
we just got home like an hour ago.
No, you didn't, and you're on this call. There you are true.
Hour and a half,
True
maybe.
royal. Wow. Did you drive wherever you were?
Yeah, we both had separate cars.
Oh my. Okay.
Wait, he went before me.
Yeah, we didn't win any awards for fuel
Yeah,
efficiency
conservation.
and conservation.
Not very good stewards this week.
Not this week, I'm afraid.
Mm. So I don't see Agnes on the call yet. I didn't hear from her, but I did. Nancy is cat sitting in Nashville, so
Oh,
she wasn't quite sure she was going to make it tonight, because she was pretty tired. Um, and I didn't hear from Linda, but we can get started. And sometimes Agnes pops in a little bit later. So
if
we'll
it's
open.
just us, would you like to have some time to yourself?
No, 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 I love Bible time. There's Agnes.
There's
Oh.
I
Agnes.
love Agnes. No, I love Bible study time. I mean, we'll talk
Okay.
about how we want to move into the summer. I felt very badly last week, but I ended up being in the office till at least 5:30, and because they were there doing something with the, what do you call them, the mini the stacks, the one mini air conditioner wasn't
split?
working. The
Yeah.
split, that's it. Yes. So that wasn't working, so he was there for quite a while. We're still not sure it's working. It's working, but it looks like it has a leak. So anyway. So we'll open with prayer. At the end of the class, we'll talk about just how we want to, what this looks like for the summer. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
With
Let us
you.
pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for bringing us to this night and the desire to be present with you and to hear your word and your wisdom. We ask, oh Lord, that you bless all those who are with us tonight and all those who can't be with us. We ask you specifically also to bless all those who seek you, don't have the opportunity to share your word or faith in you. We pray, oh Lord, that you grace us tonight with the wisdom that we need to take into the world to make Easter more of a reality than Good Friday. All this we ask in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So it's been a couple of weeks, I think, since we talked. The last we talked, we talked a little bit about, we talked a lot about how Rebecca is sort of this other half of the sky to Abraham, right? How she becomes the bearer of the promise, because Isaac certainly doesn't have a big role, but we see so much of Rebecca's faithfulness in Abraham, right? They are really meant to mirror each other, and be like kindred souls as this transition of the promise takes place between Abraham and the next generation. And when we end it, it's like, yeah, the promise is in really good shape because Rebecca is very faithful and she's very committed, and everything looks good, right? But then we have this disruption in the twins, like in her womb, right? And God gives us this oracle of destiny, right? Where he kind of radicalizes the belief, radicalizes the fact that it would have been believed in that culture that the older son got everything, right? The double of the inheritance, he got the right to represent the family spiritually. It was just ingrained in that culture. But God says to Rebecca, when the twins are in the womb, absolutely not. This is going to be, part of this inverted world that we see throughout the entire Bible, right? Scripture is all about an inverted world that doesn't play by the world's standards. And so God tells her early enough, the older is going to serve the younger. And we've already seen that come to pass, right? We've already seen Esau sell his birthright to Jacob. And he does it for a very carnal reason, right? He's hungry. He's letting his stomach guide him. He's not looking spiritually. He's not into anything beyond his immediate gratification. We will see this in 27 also with Isaac, when Isaac bestows the blessing. He's very food centric also. There's how many times in that chapter it says, Isaac loved food. It's very much like father like son, right? That's kind of where we left off. They have just sold the birthright, and now we're moving into this chapter that seems like really, really out of place. When you read this against 25, did you feel like it was a jarring experience? Or does all of Genesis feel jarring?
Yeah, and then it's
Mhm.
this same
Yeah.
repetitive
Mhm.
story with, well, tell them you're my sister, not my wife.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. This
it
is
seems to be a recurring event.
in this family, right? Yeah. It is the third sister-wife story that we'll see it seems redundant, and it seems like especially redundant there. It kind of doesn't make sense because the last chapter was moving us into, the twins, and now it's like screeched and done, turn back, put it in reverse. So I am hoping that by the end of this class, you'll understand why 26 actually does belong here. And it is totally intentional. Um, so a little bit about 26, right? This is really the only primary material that we'll see in about Isaac. He's basically a transitional figure, right? He's kind of like just what's in the middle of passing the promise on from Abraham to Jacob, right? They're kind of the main pillars of this narrative. Isaac has a theological purpose, right? We're going to see this in 26. There's a deep theology in this, more so than historical. Um, and he will be a bearer of a much different type of blessing than God bestowed on Abraham. And we'll talk about that as we get into the text. But I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to help you see how this actually fits, right, into this main body. Um, some scholars will tell us that the Isaac narrative came from the Northern Kingdom and just was kind of redacted into Genesis. That Abraham was the Southern hero. The Northern Kingdom was looking at Isaac as their patriarch, and then eventually Jacob. But I tend to disagree with that. I really do think this was a family. I'm not really positive they were redacted together. But if you read some stories, you might just, spoiler alert, you might read that. There are historians who believe that these were different figures in different parts of the kingdom, and that a redactor came in and they wove this together. So the other thing that we're going to see much, much different in the Isaac and Jacob narratives is while Abraham's narrative was based on promise, right? Everything that happens with Abraham is about promise. But because these stories of Isaac and Jacob were written in the Northern Kingdom, they didn't have to be so loyal to the Davidic monarchy that will later come along, right? We're assuming these stories were written at a much later time period. They didn't have to be loyal to any of those things. They didn't believe in a centralized worship place with the prophets. If you remember from our studies with the prophets, right? Hi Suzanne, I didn't see you came in. They don't believe in centralized worship, right? They worship at all these high places in Samaria. And so their writing is a little more earthy and nitty-gritty, right, than the Abraham narrative. Abraham's narrative is very lofty, and God is in the middle of all of it. We hear God talk. God interacts. God is just this very, not visible, but yeah, sometimes he does manifest, right? This very visible presence. The Isaac and Jacob narratives, as well as Joseph, will have God present, but kind of working in the background, right? He's not as, he doesn't present himself as much. The idea of these narratives is to theologically show us that God's promises go on despite humanity. And that we can be really, really fallible humans, but it doesn't stop God's promise. God promised to be to provide salvation, right? Promised that Abraham would be a blessing to others. As down and dirty as Jacob will get, that promise still continues all the way up to us today, right? As down and dirty as we can get. It doesn't mean that God's promise of salvation can ever be thwarted, right? God made that promise that can be taken to the bank. As much as we want to screw up, it might look more like a long and winding road, but it's not retractable. And that's really what the idea that 26 wants to show us, right? Is that despite Isaac's really bad behavior in the start of this chapter, there is hope for redemption. And that's because God is faithful. We're also going to see in the Isaac and Jacob narratives not so much about the promise. The promise will come up and God will renew that promise with both of them, and then later with Joseph. But we're going to see more of a blessing, right? This is kind of what separates Isaac's narrative from Abraham, is that now this blessing, this idea of blessing, starts to come into action. So what does that mean? It means there's actually two facets to the blessing, right? The blessing on one hand is a theological claim about God. And by that, I mean that God is the sovereign figure who has the power to bless, right? God has that power because he's sovereign and because he's faithful and because he's great, right? But the blessing can also be judged on a very worldly standard. Did you see any of that in 26?
Well, Isaac becomes rich, basically.
Yeah. Right. A very worldly measure of blessings. And this is always complex for me because like the word for blessing in Hebrew is barach, and it really means relational, right? That's ultimately what the blessing is about. It's about God's people and God having a relational presence in people's lives. That's actually what the blessing means, right? We tend to distort the meaning of blessing, right? Something great happens to us, right? And we're like, wow, what a blessing, right? And I know I've done sermons on this before. That's really not the intent of the blessing. This paragraph, this chapter will show us that that blessing can be measured against worldly standards, but it always goes back to the fact that it's because God is sovereign and God has the power to bless. And there's also a very human element in this. In order for the blessing to happen, it also requires human obedience. If we're not obedient and careful and present to God in that relationship, blessings don't naturally happen, right? Think of the promise as a gift card from a store, right? So somebody gives you a gift card and the promise is the value of that gift card. That money is there, right? And what you do with that money is available, but it doesn't happen, right? You don't get the actual tangible results of that gift card until you actually go to the store and you swipe it. And then that is the human aspect of the blessing. God made Abraham a blessing, but unless Abraham was faithful and obedient to God, it would have meant nothing. The blessing depends on our obedience. And this chapter really, really shows this, right? Blessing is used 28 times in this chapter. It is blessing centric. And it shows us in the beginning, what happens when you are not obedient to God. And at the end, it shows us what happens when you are obedient to God, right? There's a double side to this story. Isaac begins this chapter very distrustful of God, but ends this chapter very trustful of God. And the promise is handed down. This chapter probably came about 20 years before Esau and Jacob were born. It is clear in this chapter that Isaac and Rebekah do not have children. So this is a flashback. Remember in 25, it ends with Esau and Jacob, Esau selling his birthright. And now it backtracks. This is a flashback in Isaac's life. Again, for a reason. We'll talk about that at the end. Questions, comments? Am I keeping everybody at this point?
Why what's the part, or what is the reference to his disobedience in the first part of 26?
Well, because he lies, right? He lies like father, like son.
Oh,
Right.
like, yep,
Yeah.
got it.
He's obedient to the extent, John, that, so let me just look at the text, right? So there's this famine again, right? It's the first time we've heard famine since the last time his father screwed up, that he's going to screw up also, right? And it's a little bit opposite to Abraham. Isaac is a little opposite of Abraham's, right? That God appears to Isaac and he says, when God first calls Abraham, he says, go,
Mhm.
Go. But now God is saying to Isaac, stay put, stay right here where you are, right? There's this famine. Don't go down to Egypt, right? In other words, it's kind of a little bit of a reminder what his father did. God is very clear here. He doesn't want Isaac to leave where he's settled at. He doesn't want him to go to Egypt, right? Settle in the land that I will show you. It's very much like that promise to Abraham, right? Only it was go to the land that I show you. And that's a deliberate connection with Abraham. Reside in this land as an alien, and I will be with you. Remember, he's in the land of the Philistines right now. And I will be with you, right? So God promises this blessing of presence to Isaac. But, you've got to stay here, right? And God promises to fulfill that oath. And God reminds him that this was a divine oath that God swore on himself, right? I swore to you, to your father Abraham, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, right? This is just a reiteration of the blessing. Why is God faithful to that Why is God faithful to this promise? Well, he tells us in 5, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge and my commandments, my statutes and my laws. That's the reason that God is blessing with this promise, this presence, right? Because Abraham had obedience. Again, remember that for us to be a blessing to others, for us to be blessed, we first have to be obedient to God. And God reiterates that to Isaac. Questions, comments? I just want to find my place in my notes. So Isaac settles there, right? He doesn't leave. He is obedient to God. However, in 7, right, here's the big lie, right? When the men say to him, about Rebecca, he says the same as his father, she's my sister. And again, this indicates to us that this had to be way before Esau and Jacob were born, because certainly if he had toddlers running about, this lie wouldn't be so easy to pass off, right? They certainly understand he is not got any kids. And again, right, it's for the same reasons. This sin keeps reoccurring. He's afraid that they might kill me, right, for the sake of Rebecca, because she's attractive, she's beautiful in appearance. Same thing as Sarah, right? In other words, Isaac is repeating the same sin, right? It's falling right in his father's footsteps. Questions, comments?
The sins
Right.
of the father will be passed on to the children, to the
That's very-
third and fourth generation.
It's very true, Suzanne, right? Yeah. I mean, like, this apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? But and the same as us, right? Even if we're not biologically descended from any of them, right? We also fall into the same sin, right? We're infamous for that. We can fail many times and then we find ourselves still doing the same sins over and over. And he does, right? God has already told him, because your father was inevitably obedient. God leaves that inevitably out. But it doesn't seem to go, it doesn't seem to sink into Isaac. He still He still lies to save his own skin. He still lies despite that God has reminded him that he has made a vow with his father, an irrevocable vow, right? It doesn't make a difference. And again, what we saw with Abraham and Sarah, right? God has told them, I'm going to make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, right? I'm going to give your offspring all these lands, right? It should have been inferred that, like, I don't have children now. How can this happen if I don't have children? How can this happen if the Philistines kill me? It would seem very logical, right? This promise by a faithful God doesn't happen if the Philistines killed the patriarch. It should have been trust, right? But he doesn't. He falls into the sin of his father. He doesn't even stop to think about it. He just lies to save his skin. He doesn't think like Abraham. What could happen to these people, right? He puts a nation in jeopardy. He puts his wife in jeopardy. He's just self-centered, right? And unfaithful to God. And then, the king of the Philistines, right? He looks out the window and he sees some hanky-panky there with Rebecca. That shouldn't be happening with your sister. And so he calls him in, right? And he says, and bear in mind, you're saying, well, wait, this guy fell for this already. Remember, this is probably just a title, right? It means this isn't, it's a title for king, right? It's like Pharaoh. So it doesn't mean it's the same person that this happened to with Abraham. And so he calls him in. He's probably like his grandson also. And he says, so she's your wife. Why did you say this? And he fesses up, right? Because I thought I might die. And then, the king, again, very much like the Abraham scenario. The king is the one that's showing the faith, right? Not Abraham. He's worried about it. I mean, he's so worried about it that he tells his people, like, don't even touch this man or this woman, or else, you'll be put to death. Recognizing, right? The king is recognizing this person who is not a person of the faith, who doesn't know God in the personal way that the patriarchs do, is saying, I can see that God is present, and if you touch him, bad things, or his wife, bad things will happen to us. This God is very powerful. So Isaac stays as an alien, right? And he sows seed in the land. That's significant. It means that he is made the decision that he's going to stay in that land. This is the beginning of this agricultural life of Israel. Up to that point, Abraham, and even when Isaac is younger, before he marries Rebecca, is living like a semi-nomadic life. Like, you'll plant, and when the crops are gone, then you'll move on. But this shows that Isaac has intent to stay in the land, right? Which is hugely important for the promise. Right? That promise of land. Isaac is almost, in a way, claiming that land here. He's settling on that land. And because he stays, right, he lies and he's conniving and he puts a whole lot of people in jeopardy, including his wife. But because he's obedient to God's command to stay, and because God is faithful to the promise, right, Isaac reaps 100-fold, which is huge. That's a huge amount of money, especially for someone who this is his first attempt at agriculture. It's huge. And God blesses him. God blesses him. And we must assume that, that Abraham has given him all this inheritance, right? Abraham is not a poor man. But this is the first time that we're told that Isaac is creating his own wealth, right? The man became rich. The blessing of God, right? He's obedient. He does what God says, even though he really screws up. And God blesses him with harvest. He blesses him with not just harvest, with this outrageous amount, right? It's 100-fold. Jesus uses that hundredfold in the New Testament to talk about, you know, tremendous rewards, tremendous reaping. And the man became rich, right? He prospered more and more, right? It's progressive. His wealth is progressive, right? Look at those words, more and more, right? He's rich. He became rich, but now he's prospering more and more. And then he became very rich, right? That clarifying word, very. He had possessions of flocks and herds and a grand household, right? This is the narrator building the blessings, right? These blessings being seen through the eyes of a worldly perspective, right? Remember, the theological perspective is God has the power to bless. The worldly perspective is, you know, the material things that are coming into Isaac's hands. Questions, comments?
Tammy, I do have a
Yeah, Barbara,
question.
tell me.
So at this point,
hmm
the Philistines recognize him as being blessed by God, or they don't?
Yes, they do. Yeah, they do. And we'll read that later in this in Genesis 26, Barbara. It will be an acknowledgement. Right now, so where we're at, like up until 17, 26, 17, right? There's pretty much just fear of him. There's fear, there's envy, they're not quite sure. But when we get to the end of the chapter, we'll actually have the Philistines saying to him, you know, we recognize that you're a man of God, right?
And that's
Mhm.
what I mean. So if they recognize in the beginning that he's a man of God, I mean, they want him to go away at that
Mhm.
point because they say you're too powerful. But
Yeah.
then they come back and say, oh, you know, you're favored by God. Didn't they recognize he was favored by God when he became rich? Or I guess not.
So I think it's accumulating, Barbara. I mean, that's an excellent question. I don't necessarily think that here in 26, I mean, they're certainly fearful of him. They certainly see that he's being richly blessed, right? And reaping lots and lots of material things, right? And in the ancient Near East at that time, like material prosperity would have been recognized as a gift from any god, right? That's why
Right.
you were always appeasing the gods, so that you would have a good crop, so that you would have fertility in your house, so that you would have a long life. You know, it was a cycle of appeasing gods. And so they certainly recognize that there's something that makes him stand out because he is accumulating all of these material things, right?
Right.
But it's not until the end of 26 when the Philistines, right, when the king actually uses this word that is probably very easy to look over, but means something huge, right? Let me see here if I can find it. Um, you are now blessed of the Lord, right? It's 29. And the word that they use, right, is the capital Lord. Right? Not the small case
Right.
Lord, which would mean master. They use the capital, right? Adonai, which is the word for God's personal name, Yahweh, right? When the Philistines are dealing with Abraham, they don't use Lord to describe the God of Abraham. They use Elohim, which is a generic God, right? But now they are recognizing that this God of this really rich and powerful man is a one sovereign and powerful God. So it's huge. I mean, they not only recognize him as being
Okay.
blessed by God, they recognize the God behind that blessings as Yahweh.
Okay. That makes sense. Much more
Does that make
sense.
yeah.
Yeah.
sense, Barbara? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is a huge statement. I mean, they're not only acknowledging the blessing, they're acknowledging the power behind that blessing as being the one sovereign God of the universe. I mean, they're not converted. But then God never says, you know, when you go into Canaan, convert the Canaanites, right? Abraham's never given that commission. It's just live among them, right? And whoever comes in contact with you will be blessed. But this is a huge statement. This is a turning point. that the Philistines recognize the presence of Yahweh as, remember, the theology of that blessing, as the one who's powerful enough to give that blessing.
Got it.
Questions, comments so far? I mean, and that's really important to us too, right? Because what that says to us is that, the source of these blessings, right? It doesn't come because the soil's good. It doesn't come because it was just a good season. It doesn't come for, all of these things that we credit blessings for. Like I bought a new car because I won the lottery. What a blessing, right? It doesn't come from any of these things. The source of the blessing, as per Genesis, is always God. And this chapter is an acknowledgement of that. It acknowledges that this one universal God is the source of all blessings. And it also recognizes that, that blessings come from God and that we have to be obedient for those blessings to happen. And that nothing is luck or coincidence. Right? If it relates to universal salvation and God's promise, nothing's going to foul it up. And along the way, if you're obedient, God will allow these blessings. You'll be blessed, which is like the fuel of the promise that makes the blessing manifest.
But then is this what lays the foundation for kind of this, this more this gospel of prosperity stuff? Kind of this
So,
this
John.
bastardization of the teaching,
Mhm.
God's going to bestow all these earthly riches on you if
Mhm.
you whatever.
Yeah, so yes and no, right? So how do I explain this? So yeah, no, this is much different, right? Because it's wrapped in promise. Like the blessings are always a way to get to the manifestation of the promise, right? It's not blessings for no reason. It's not blessings just because, like, the blessing of prosperity, right? It that's just blessing. This is the promise wrapped in blessing. The blessing is actually the vehicle to the promise. So it's not just like you're rewarded because you've done something, right? That gets into the whole Pauline argument about faith versus, actions.
Yeah.
Mhm. We will see this disputed, right? Because Israel has a habit in their scripture writing, right? They have a habit of cause and effect, right? Of saying like, oh, you've done this, so God has blessed you. And then when we see wisdom literature sort of coming to its maturing, when it's coming to maturation, we see that there's a change in that, right? What book do we see that change in? Job, right? Which is the counter to that. Where, all these awful things happen to this really obedient, faithful man. And the conclusion is, well, God is just God and things happen. It is not linked to what you do. Good things can happen to you if you're not obedient, and bad things can happen to you if you're really obedient. Israel started to shy away from that during the exile period of that prosperity and saying, sometimes,
Yeah, I think they'd have to.
mhm, yeah. But we see that turning point when we get to the book of Job that counters this. But here, remember what makes this different is that it is coming with the promise. Even though, we see glimpses of the promise here, the ultimate, push of God is ultimately pushing the plan of salvation through redemption and salvation. And these blessings are like the fuel that fuel that promise so that they can get to the next step. We don't see that in Abraham, right? We only really see the promise in Abraham. But it's here where it starts to become more blessing centered. And again, it certainly recognizes that these blessings can be weighed against, the world's view of prosperity. But ultimately, what Genesis would tell us, specifically in the Isaac and Jacob story, is that, yeah, but it is ultimately God who's steering the boat. Questions, comments? Does that make sense?
Okay.
So just stop me if it doesn't. It's heavy stuff. Um, so we see this, right? So we see Isaac accumulating these blessings, and he becomes very powerful. He becomes very wealthy. He has a great household. We can assume that he probably lost some of his household to famine, right? But he's rebuilt. He's rebuilt that because he's obedient to God. He stays when God says stay. He lies a little bit, right? Happens to all of us. Sins a little bit, happens to all of us. But ultimately, he was obedient and he was faithful to God's word. And these blessings happen. And what happens after he gets these blessings?
They kick him out.
They kick him out, right? They get jealous of him, right? They get jealous. And we're told that, the Philistines had been stopping up the wells that Abraham had dug, right? Some years have gone by. Abraham is out of sight, out of mind, and they've been filling up the holes. They've been filling up those wells, right? Which is like a death sentence in this part of the world, right?
And why are they doing that? To push
So,
him
so
out?
yeah, so they're jealous of him, right? They're jealous. And remember, if you or your ancestor dug a well, right, you were considered, even if you were an alien, you were considered the benefactor of that well. That well belonged to you. But now he's so overwhelmingly rich and probably, has a huge household that they're jealous and they just start to block up these wells. Maybe to be, a subtle hint to get out of here. You don't belong, you're an alien. Maybe because they'd like to see him, you know, drop dead. Because it's a source of life. But they're filling up these wells, right? And eventually, like Suzanne said, they go and say, you become too powerful for us. Get out of here. And he does. He leaves, right? He departs from there. And he settles again. But
So
then
is,
Mhm,
sorry, just for clarity. So
mhm,
it says he camped in the valley of Gerar. So
mhm,
that's different than Gerar, I assume, because he went to Gerar and he's getting thrown out of Gerar.
mhm.
Okay, so the valley of Gerar is someplace else.
He goes a little off distance, right? He goes about 10
Okay,
or 15 miles off.
thank you.
Right. He leaves kind of that region where they are. And, he settles probably about 10, 15 miles out, right? And he does this thing that's interesting, right? He begins to dig again the wells that had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. Right. And as he digs them, right? And here I want you to know that this is also a theological statement. He's just not digging just to dig, right? It is a reclamation of the promise. It is him reclaiming the right of the covenant with God. Remember, wells they have a spiritual symbolism to them, right? Wells symbolize, um, they don't symbolize wealth. They symbolize sustenance and survival, right? God allows wells to be found, right, by faithful people because it's survival. Without a well, you die, right? God sees our deepest desperation and he provides. And so these wells not only have a physical meaning that people are dependent on them to live, your crops are dependent on them. You can't have herds without a well, but they also are very symbolic, right? Of of God's providence, God's abundance, God's promise to see us in all of our need and to answer those needs, right? They're a literal lifeline and they are a spiritual lifeline. A well is the ultimate sign of survival. And so by digging up these wells, right, Isaac is reclaiming this covenant with God that was with his father. And he's doing it in a legal means, right? He's recognizing that this is his right as the son of Abraham, who the covenant was given to. This is his right, and he's reclaiming that right of covenant with God. He is ready to continue God's promise. And as he digs them up, people aren't happy. They're fighting back, right? And he's giving them these very names that signify what's happening, right? He calls one, Isaac, and it's like dispute, contention. And he names the other one that means accusation and hostility, right? All of those spiritual things that we face when we begin to assert our relationship with God, right? We also face hostility. We also face dispute, right? These are the spiritual weapons that he's facing as he's trying to reclaim this covenant with God, this relationship with God. So,
Penny, how long does it usually take to build to dig a well?
ooh, that's a good
Back-
question,
back
Barbara.
then?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to. That is a really good question. It would probably take a little bit of time. Now remember, he is only digging out where they've been stopped up, right? He's not actually at this point like digging a well. He will get there, but right now he's just unstopping them.
Okay.
Yeah, it probably, a couple weeks.
Okay, because I'm saying
Mhm.
this has to, I mean, it's not until it gets to the seventh one that he's
Mhm.
allowed to settle that, that's the part of the land he settles.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean,
So,
now he's just, staking his territory
right.
and showing that he is the rightful heir to this covenant promise.
But doesn't
Mhm.
he, when somebody disputes the well and says, okay,
Mhm.
that's ours because now there's water, doesn't he kind of just back off and say, okay, let me
He
move a little
does.
bit further, move a
He
little bit
does.
further? Okay.
He does. Yep, he does. He does retreat, but then eventually he comes back, right? Eventually he comes back.
Only because they invite him back, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
But he does. He moves on, right? He's not going to cause, all out war, which this certainly
Right.
would be, cause for. He's not going to cause that. He's just redigging. They get upset. He moves on. Right. And he's naming these spiritual battles, right? Contention. Right? They quarrel and then he moves on and he digs another one. And this one they don't quarrel over, right? And he says, now the Lord has made room for us and we shall be fruitful, right? Goes back to that very first blessing in the Garden of Eden.
Mm.
Remember the blessing, when the blessing's first given to humanity, it's to be fruitful and multiply, right? And now that he has found this space, right, that he has claimed, this kind of sanctuary, peaceful space, he says, he recognizes the blessing. We can be here and we can begin that blessing, right, of being fruitful and multiplying here. But then in 23, right, he goes back up to Beersheba. And remember, Beersheba has a really significant role in Abraham's life. That was kind of Abraham's sphere. And so now he's decided he's going to go back, right, to the Beersheba region. And God appears, right, and gives him this reassurance. Don't be afraid. I'm with you, and I will bless you and make your offering numerous, right? This is the reiteration of the promise. It's going to do it for my servant Abraham's sake, right? The obedience of Abraham. And so Isaac builds an altar, right? And he calls on the name of the Lord and he pitches his tent, and there they dug a well. Questions, comments?
Feel bad for the servants. They're digging a lot of wells.
They are digging a lot of wells. I imagine he had a lot of servants, right? But they are digging wells. And this is a very bold move for Isaac to come back, into this kind of close proximity with people who were probably really ready to kill him at least, right? But he does it. He does it through this confidence in God's promise, right? He goes back to where Abraham was. He restores this as a public place of worship, right? He digs this well. And it's done being faithful to God's promise. Right now, he's not thinking about danger. Beginning of 26, he was thinking about danger. These people are going to kill me. And now he even knows that these people have it in for him because there's, jealousy does a lot of stuff, causes really things we say would never happen to happen. But he goes into Beersheba and he decides he's going to settle there. He takes that chance because he's trusting in God this time, right? There's a turnaround from the beginning of this chapter. He has a transformation where in the beginning he didn't trust God, but now he's going to trust God. And God reiterates that promise. Once he puts himself out there, right? God reiterates that promise of presence. And then what happens in 26, right? Here comes the king. And they ask him, they come, and they could have really come to start war, right? Isaac has pushed the buttons a little bit. They're already jealous, right? And this could have been an enormous breakout of conflict. And they acknowledge, right? They say, we plainly see that the Lord, right? Capital Lord, Yahweh, has been with you. So they offer an oath, right? To make a covenant. This is exactly what happens with Abraham. So that you'll do us no harm. And just as we've not touched you, you won't do anything. You are now the blessed of the Lord, right? All of this acknowledgement that all of this prosperity that Isaac has come about is all at the hand of God. And foreigners recognize that. Not just people on the inside. Foreigners recognize that this one powerful God is behind all of this. Questions, comments? And I want to say that this recognition that the king of the Philistines gives him, right, is not just an assertion of God's presence with Isaac in that moment, right? It is an assertion that they have recognized that God has been with Isaac, that God is still with Isaac, and that God will be with Isaac in the future, right? This eternal God is with Isaac, past, present, and future. I will be with you. I am with you. Yahweh has been with you. And so they strike up a covenant. Who knows? Who knows, what's motivating the Philistines? Certainly fear. They certainly know that at one time Isaac's father was powerful enough to raise an army of 138 men, right, to defeat Canaanite Philistine forces. They know that Abraham, had some allies in that region. They have to assume that Isaac, could assert that. They also know that probably Ishmael is Isaac's brother, might join this fray, right? And so they make this covenant. They make peace with Isaac. Isaac makes peace with them. What makes this really significant? If you look at chapter 26 from the beginning and you look at the end, what makes this significant? But this is a transformed Isaac. Would you say yes?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. In what way, Barb?
Well, at first he comes there and he's afraid. So
Mm-hmm.
of course he lies and says,
Mm-hmm.
that's a sister. But then it seems he finds his faith or relies totally on God.
Absolutely.
and he does it in a very peaceful but um, um, affirmative way, you know,
Absolutely.
and especially when he digs out the wells and, okay, all right, keep that. Let me move on. I'll find out where God wants me to be. So he
Yes.
then goes to the place, okay, God has made room for us here,
Mm-hmm.
but then he goes back. The going back to Bathsheba,
Mm-hmm.
is like, okay, but that's what was promised to me, so I
Mm-hmm.
know that I'm gonna get that. So, and he's not afraid. So
Absolutely.
it's definitely a different person from the beginning.
Absolutely, Barbara. And you nailed it, right? That is exactly what we see in this chapter, right? There is this spiritual transformation of him to the point where he even gets, really, really gutsy, right? That
Yeah.
could have been an all-out war. They could have killed him. But he doesn't. He makes dinner, right? He gives them a meal. He's like his father. He gives them a meal. And there's a covenant made with them.
And the way the other thing is the way you described it, it also transforms the Philistines from the very beginning. They know
Yeah,
they know he's favored by a god. By the end of it, they know he's favored by the God.
the God.
So yeah,
Yeah, absolutely, right? And there's peace.
yeah,
Whether they were converted or whatever happened to them, whether they became worshipers of Yahweh or not. But there's peace, right? There's this coexistence.
right,
Why? Because Isaac was inevitably trustful of God and obedient. He gave God enough of that little obedience, right, in the beginning of 26 to be able to be blessed, right, to receive that blessing. By staying in the land, he opened himself up to that blessing. He fouled up and he sinned and he went the wrong way, but ultimately he was obedient. And because he was open and because he listened to God, he was open to those blessings, and the blessings happen, right? And then Isaac transforms. He trusts God. The beginning, he was distrustful. Now he's trusting in God. And as he trusts in God, he's able to reclaim, that covenant relationship. He's able to reclaim the promise. He's able to assert all of that. He becomes spiritually stronger. And when he does, right, it is a peace. He realizes that you don't have to fight. If God has given you this promise and God is blessing you, there's no need for conflict. There's only need for trust. That's a beautiful message. He realizes you don't have to be deceptive. You can trust God to do what God says God's going to do. And when he does, this is the fruit of it. There's peace. He's got the land, right? There's peace in the valley. Questions, comments about that? Does everybody understand kind of like, and again, remember, this isn't chronological. It's not meant to be chronological. It's not, it's meant to be theological more than anything, right? Do I think it's historical? Yeah, I do, right? But it's more than just history. It's theology, right? It is the theology of a God who's powerful enough to bless. It's a theology of a God who's faithful enough to continue God's promise even when humanity screws up. Questions, comments? Right at the end, we get this, why is Beersheba named that way? That was probably actually added on after the exile. That's a later piece that's been attached to this writing. Remember, Beersheba means well of seven or well of the oath. Vows, oath and seven, the number seven, like in Hebrew, there is like no numbers, they're attached to letters. So the seventh letter of the Hebrew alphabet shares the same three root letters as oath. So whenever you would take a vow in Judaism, right, it would be like I'm sevened, like we sevened with each other, right? Because it's a vow. and it comes from seven. Seven means wholeness, completeness. And so this is probably tacked on to the end of this chapter, just to explain the name of Beersheba, right? Where they take this oath, they seven each other, they seven with each other.
I mean, I know it's not chronological, but it
Mhm.
is strange, I find, because at the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of 23, it says,
Mhm.
from there he went up to Beersheba.
Mhm.
And then at the end, they're like, so now he named the city Beersheba.
Mhm. Yeah, John, right? Because that was
It's
it,
just,
that's
we just can't, I assume I just can't be tied to a strict chronological
it's not.
exposition.
I just dropped my bookmark. Hold on. Yeah, no, it's not.
Okay,
It's not. And remember, there's things tacked on to Genesis that were
Right.
written like at the end of or right at the begin, like the end of the exile into the beginning. And that was probably a piece that was just added on to it to explain the meaning. It's really important in Genesis to explain the meaning of names, right? Why was to put a theological significance to important places.
Well, also, if you're writing this down after
Mhm.
the fact,
Mm-hmm.
if a place name is changed, you're going to give
Mm.
the current place name so that people know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that too, Suzanne. Yeah, that's exactly right too, right? Because the Philistines, right, are not the Philistines that we think of when they talk about this, right? Those Philistines, like where Goliath comes from, they do not exist at this point. They don't come along for another 1,000 years after this writing, right? Philistines is kind of a generic term that's used in here to mean residents of Canaan, some kind of resident of Canaan. There's different residents of Canaan, right? But Philistine is not the Philistines that, the seafaring people on the coast that Goliath is descended from. But that's exactly right, Suzanne. Sometimes there has to be clarifications because the names of places did change. And what and sometimes there's a couple of them, right? Because it was this town then and then it changes here, and so sometimes it is just it's a clarification, and it also gives a theological meaning behind how things get their names. It's really important, especially in Genesis, right? This is why we get all the names of these wells. But I mean, this is a really great story for us today, right? Because it shows us that, if God has promised that, God is faithful to that promise, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. It takes an effort on our part. It takes two to tango, right? We don't reap the blessings that God promises if we're not obedient to God's word. It takes us to be obedient to receive those blessings. Really important in the secular world today. So why is it here? Why is it there, right? Because this seems like this would have been a natural way to this seems like this chapter would have fit much better where 25 is. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? We know at the end of 25 that, it ends, 25 ends, it says, then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah and she became his wife and he loved her, right? So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. This seems like a natural segue to this. Like, why do we get all this stuff about the death of Abraham, and then we get the twins, and then we flash back to a time long before the twins were born, probably 20 years before the twins were born. And then we jump ahead in 27, right, to Isaac blessing Jacob. Like, why in the world is all of this? Why was this placed here? And the answer falls back. Does anybody have an idea before I give you the answer?
no.
Everybody else agree with John? No idea,
Yeah,
right?
no
Well, I'm
idea.
speaking for myself. I don't.
Do you have an idea? It's okay. Any idea you want to throw out is valid. Well, it goes back to what Barbara said, right? This tremendous spiritual transformation of Isaac. And where this begins, right? What was the last thing we saw before this chapter began?
It's Jacob feeding Esau.
Yeah, it was Jacob, kind of deceiving Esau out of his birthright. Not that Esau wasn't a willing participant, right? And then what do we see in chapter 27?
Well, we see Jacob, he switches the fraud, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Same kind of fraud.
We see Jacob, living into his name as the trickster, and stealing his brother's, the blessing. I mean, it's kind of willingly given over by Isaac. But yeah, so the idea is that all of these things, the spiritual transformation that happened with Isaac, should have been happening also with his son. And it's there to contrast, what spiritual transformation looks like between what happens with his kids, with his kid. So all of this transformation that Isaac goes through is a contrast to what happens to Jacob in the beginning of his narrative. And so it is really strategically placed there. Make sense? This is the transformation we would expect from Jacob, but we don't see that for a while with Jacob. Lots of stuff happens before we see this transformation in Jacob. And so it is put together in this fashion, right? The redactor put this material together in this fashion to show us this is what it should look like. Yes, we're fallible humans, but you really can undergo spiritual transformation, which is not happening to Isaac's kid. Both of them, right? I mean, there's a lot of scholars who have sympathy. I've read a lot of commentaries by people who have had sympathy for Esau. I am not particularly sympathetic with Esau. Jacob is like one of my favorite characters. And when we talk about the chapter 27, we'll talk about why Esau really isn't to be admired that much. He is when he reconciles with his brother. I mean, that's a great transformation story, right? That's another transformation that Esau undergoes. He's very admirable in that chapter. But here, not so much, right? In 27, he's not this admirable character. Esau is not to be pitied. He goes into this, he might not know his blessing's gonna be taken away from him. But he's not really cared too much about God and this promise in his story. He's very carnal himself, very much like his father will become. And so we have this little ending, right, in 34.
Yeah, what's that about?
Mhm. Yeah, so when Esau was 40 years old, right? 40 is actually the age that his father got married. He married Judith, right? He does exactly what Abraham says don't do, right? He marries outside of the clan. He marries women who are not part of the promise, right? And it makes their life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Right. It is kind of showing us that Esau, excuse me, is not this spiritual creature either, right? These marriages would have made him not even eligible to carry the promise. He broke Abraham's command not to leave the area and marry outside of the clan, and he does. And so he would have been ineligible to inherit the promise just because he's married pagan women, right? Hittites, enemies of Israel. And it becomes bitter, right? It is this word that they use, right? Bitter is like this, it just is soul, it pains their soul that he stepped outside of the clan to marry. Then it leads up, right? It's a really good intro to 27 so that we don't feel totally sorry for Esau. Right? He is not this spiritual creature that's concerned about the blessing of the promise. He violates his grandfather's command. right? And Rebecca and Isaac are angry, they're sorrowful, they're pained, they're grieved, right? It makes their life bitter. Esau will later try to redeem this. He will marry somebody from Ishmael's tribe, but it's really too late for him. Um, he would have made himself ineligible for the promise anyway. This is a very dysfunctional family who seem to bring on their own troubles. But that's really what the narrator wanted us to see in this narrative, right? This very dysfunctional family who like to take things into their own hands and who like to, do things their way, even when it means deception. God is still working through these people. God doesn't abandon ship. God doesn't say, "Hey, they're too long gone, for me to bring any good out of this situation." He works despite these people. He works despite us. This is our job too, right? Is to bear that promise to the world.
Kind of goes against the narrative that grace doesn't show up until the New Testament.
Well, Suzanne, I would say, yeah, yes and no, right? I would say that while they don't use the word grace in the Hebrew Bible, that grace is very much present, right? I mean, God certainly still is bestowing grace. How do you see that?
Well, that's what I meant. I mean, people today will say, "Oh, well, the Old Testament was all about the law and breaking the law, and the New Testament is all about grace." The Old Testament was about grace too.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They don't call it grace, right? But certainly God is bestowing grace. We see that right from the get-go in the garden, right? It's grace that allows God to, yeah, there's a punishment, but it is God's grace that doesn't banish Adam and Eve out of his sight forever. God's grace that, that Cain survives, right? It's all about God's grace. So yes, you are correct that people that read the New Testament and say, well, that's not the same God. Jesus's father couldn't have been this God because this is a vindictive God. This in no way deters from God's grace. In fact, it enhances it, right? Look at this story in 26, where, Isaac totally falls into the sin of his father and repeats, does a repeat performance. And yet God continues to make that promise still viable, still workable, doesn't rescind it, because of God's grace. You're absolutely correct, Suzanne. That's absolutely right. Anybody else for this chapter? Did that help put this chapter into a little bit of better perspective?
Sure.
Yeah. And again, in this chapter is a little different, again, probably because came from stories from a different region. Again, you're going to see this is a very earthy this is a very earthly tellings, right? There's no like morals in this story, and it's not to condone any of this behavior, right? It's simply putting out what humanity is, and again elevating God and saying, well, yeah, humans are really really fallible and they really mess up, but this great God and God's grace, right, um ensures and carries through to bring about the plan of salvation for all nations through this one family, despite themselves. Anything else we need to say? So I don't know how you all want to proceed with the summer. I would really like at least to get next weekend because I would really love to get just kind of the last thing about Isaac out of the way. And then however you guys want to want to proceed for the summer, we can do. We can take a break after next week and come back in September. We can meet every couple weeks. We can meet totally up to you guys, how you want to proceed. So if you want to think about it and let me know next week, we can make that decision next week. But let's at least, whatever we decide, get through to this wonderful chapter 27, this blessing, when the whole Jacob narrative kind of just launches.
Okay, so 27 for next week.
27 for next week. Yeah, we should be able to get through it. This is a great chapter. And you know, it's a long chapter. Maybe next week and 9th, that would be the end of June already. Wow. Okay, and then we can talk about where we want to go for the summer. But we will get through 27 at least, I hope.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Sure.
Yep.
Perfect. So keep reading, and if you guys have any questions, reach out to me, and I hope that put things in kind of better perspective for this whole storyline, right? Because very different storyline than Abraham. Look for those blessings in this. Those blessings that, you know, the promises being wrapped in blessings. Anything else we need to say?
No.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.